In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins looks at three of the premises behind the Christian belief that the sacrifice of Jesus will atone for our sins, and he calls the whole thing, and I quote, barking mad. The first premise is that God created humans in such a way that he knew, because of his omniscience, we couldn't help but be sinful, yet he's angry at us for that inevitable sin. Second premise is that God is all just, that is all fair, but his anger at the guilty party is appeased through the bloody torture and sacrifice of an innocent party. And third, that this innocent and tortured and bloodied party was, well, himself, because Jesus is God, which makes God the plaintiff, the jury, the judge, and the execution victim. Now, on page 253 of The God Delusion, Dawkins suggests that this is something probably all of us would dismiss as just barking mad if it were presented to us fresh, but that, as he writes, its ubiquitous familiarity has dulled our objectivity. Now, in this video, however, I'm going to present my reasons for why I don't think it's actually all barking mad. That is, at least not when you look at the story from the perspective of comparative mythology and you trace each of these premises back to a time period when its ideas were not quite as irrational as they may seem today. Now, also, when I discuss this subject in my book, Dialogue with Christian Proselytizer, I include the Christian side, the Christian explanation for this, which involves a discussion on original sin and God's justice and punishment, God's sorrow and his mercy, love, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice, and some complex details on the Trinity. But for the purpose of focus and momentum, I'm just going to bypass those topics, and this is going to be a largely secular presentation. So for any Christians who may be watching this, I know you have a completely different explanation for everything I'm going to say, so my apologies for excluding all that from this particular video series. All right, so back to the secular perspective. All right, first, as for explaining God's anger, this falls right in line with the ancient religious belief that life's fortunes and misfortunes reflected the mood of the gods. Now, in today's world, we take knowledge about our natural world for granted. But just think about how baffling the ways of nature must have seemed to our earliest ancestors. Think about the way daylight can last 16 hours or more, depending on where you live. Then it starts shrinking down to 12, to 10, to 8. So many of our earliest ancestors must have not known, or must have thought maybe it's going to keep on shrinking. Maybe it's going to disappear altogether. And paralleling the shrinking sunlight, of course, was colder weather, and crops die, game is harder to find. So whether or not the sun and warm weather would return was truly terrifying. It must have been terrifying and really a life or death issue. And look at the way the rains, sometimes they just seem like they're designed to nourish humans, but other times the rain is out to destroy humans, either with flood or just by refusing to appear at all. So in trying to make sense of all this, a common conclusion was that all of nature's events were under the control of supernatural spirits, spirits with human-like emotions. So when good things happen, people reason, well, the spirits must be pleased. When bad things happen, people reason the spirits must be less than pleased, and sometimes even furious with humans. And I feel this is maybe an understandable conclusion. You just look at how intense thunderstorms can terrify children. There's loud claps of thunder. They really do sound angry. So it makes sense, at least during ancient times, to conclude that this apparent anger of nature reflected the anger of the gods. Now I'm going to read some passages from Greek and from Hebrew and Viking mythology. And notice how they all share a similar fear to what they interpret as the anger of nature. And in these passages, they'll all make references to the anger of the ocean. Okay, from the Greeks, here's a passage from Book 5 of the Odyssey, and this dates back to the 800s BC. Thereon Poseidon gathered his clouds together, grasped his trident, stirred it round in the sea, and roused the rage of every wind that blows, till earth, sea, and sky were hidden in cloud, and night sprang forth out of the heavens. Now, moving on to Hebrew mythology, I'm going to read a book, I'm going to read from the book of Jeremiah. And this is a book from a similar time period, just dating back to a few centuries after the Odyssey was recorded. Okay, this is from chapter 5, verse 22. How can it be that you don't even tremble in my presence? I set the shorelines of the world by perpetual decree, so that the oceans, though they toss and roar, can never pass those bounds. Isn't such a God to be feared and worshipped? All right, the next one is from the Vikings, from the Prosida, and this dates to the 800s AD. Aegir, giant of the sea, is the one who grinds the white meal and brews the foaming beer of the sea. He is married to Ran, the deceitful Ran, who catches everyone who falls into the sea in her net and drags them down to her halls. So from the perspective of comparative mythology, it's no surprise that people often thought the gods were angry, or at least that the gods had violent mood swings. Now, I'd also like to say that I'd hope that it goes without saying that it's really no longer rational to hold these beliefs today. I mean, for example, tornadoes, they certainly look and sound like they're full of rage. But today we know what causes them. We know when there's a low layer of moist hot air, and then there's an upper layer of hot dry air that prevents that lower layer from rising. And then there's some kind of triggering mechanism, like a cold front that can punch through that top layer. And this explains why there's certain areas in the Midwest that are nicknamed Tornado Alley. And these are the areas where the moist hot air from Mexico meets with the dry air from the Rockies, and it all collides with cold air from Canada. So rather than blaming the morality of the local population, it's these kind of facts. They not only explain natural disasters, they can also predict where these natural disasters will strike next. Now, if it were all about morality, my guess is that New York City might just get a few more tornadoes than Kansas City. But because it's all due to natural and totally indifferent causes, we can accurately predict that Kansas will continue to get far more tornadoes than New York ever will. But back in ancient times, I don't think it's fair to criticize this conclusion that it was all about divine rage at human misbehavior. I mean, I'm guessing I might have thought the same too. Now, next topic. Given this belief that the gods have violent mood swings, the next step is to figure out a way how to make an angry God happy again. To be continued in part 2.